Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter. Welcome to the UW Now, where we bring you experts from the UW community talking about timely and important topics. It's been 5 months since we first discussed the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just a few days after it began. Have things gone as expected? Has the NATO alliance been effective in providing military support for Ukraine? Are the sanctions against Russia working? How is Putin's alliance with China affecting the geopolitical landscape? And how will all of this affect global economic, political, and military alliances in the decades to come? Joining us this evening are three UW experts who will discuss the current state of the war and the future of global alliances. Mark Copelovitch is Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs and Director of the Center for European Studies. Yoshiko Herrera is a Professor of Comparative Politics and International Relations and former Director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. And leading us off this evening will be Andrew Kydd, a Professor of Political Science and affiliate of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. I want to thank you all for taking time to be with us tonight. I know August isn't always the high season. Sometimes people want to take vacations, and I know some of you are taking some time out of yours to be with us. So leading us off, as I said, is Professor Kydd. His research interests center on the game theoretic analysis of international security issues, such as proliferation, terrorism, trust, and conflict resolution. All pretty important topics right now, I'd say. He's published articles in the American Political Science Review, International Organization, World Politics, and International Security, among other journals. His book, Trust and Mistrust in International Relations, was published in 2005 by Princeton University Press and won the 2006 Conflict Processes Best Book Award. Prior to joining UW-Madison's Department of Political Science, he taught at the University of California, Riverside and Harvard University. Andrew, thanks for joining us and for leading us off tonight. I look forward to your remarks.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having us, and thanks for reconvening this group to discuss this important topic. So I am going to talk a little bit about the war from a military perspective, how it started, how it's going right now, what we can expect in the near-term future, and then possible solutions for the long term, or ways this might play out in the long term. And that will hopefully set the stage for the discussion to come. If you could go to the next slide. So last time we spoke, last time we met, this was the map that I showed you. And it shows a bunch of things that are kind of relevant, but we've almost forgotten in the intervening 5 months. Number one, up in the north, how important, like perhaps the most important advance in theater of the war was the attack on Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. And the red little V up there in the north, north of the capital, is Russian-held territory. They'd come in from the north through Belarus and from Russia, trying to take the capital in a sort of lightning strike. And there were other advances in the north as well, in particular near the second largest Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, shown off to the right there in the north. And there were, at that point, somewhat lesser advances coming up from the south out of Crimea and from the east in the Donbass region, where they had been supplying and supporting separatists against the Ukrainian government. And at that point, it was a real possibility that the Ukrainian government might fall. They might capture Kyiv. They might capture the new President Zelensky, and at least decapitate the government, if not cause the entire military to collapse and be able to conquer quickly, which is obviously what they had in mind, what they were hoping for. But that was already sort of looking a little rocky from the Russian perspective at that point, and subsequently that became clear that that was simply not going to happen. If you go to the next slide, we'll see where we are today. And note all of that red territory up in the north is now reclaimed by Ukraine. Kyiv is very far from the front lines at this point. Even Kharkiv is not nearly surrounded as it used to be. And instead, you have this belt of Russian-held territory from just east of Kharkiv through these provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk in the far east, and then around the south through Mariupol, which was conquered at great cost, over to Kherson in the central south, just north of Crimea. And the front line is basically stabilized in that along those lines for the past several months, with incremental gains in the Luhansk, Donetsk region over in the east. And so that's where we are now. That's where the front lines are stabilized. Both sides are dug in on either side, and both sides are engaging in a lot of artillery warfare across those relatively stable front lines. So if you go to the next slide. So there's been a lot of talk about a southern offensive, about the Ukrainians retaking territory in the south. In particular, they have their eyes on the city of Kherson, which is shown there in the map. It's on the Dnipro River, which is the river that sort of runs through the center of Ukraine, and Kyiv is on it farther north. And there's a hope both to take that city and to take all of the land on the western side of the Dnipro River away from the Russians as a sort of, both an achievement worthy in its own right, liberating the city and the population, but also as a symbolic victory, showing that the Ukrainians are capable of launching offensive operations. I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether this is going to succeed for a variety of reasons. Typically in these sorts of attrition war type campaigns, you need to have, the rule of thumb is you need to have a 3-to-1 local force advantage over the adversary to successfully break through the front lines, if those are heavily defended, as these lines probably are. And it's not clear that the Ukrainians have anything like a 3-to-1 force advantage locally, even in personnel, which would be the most likely thing that they might have the advantage in, but certainly not in heavy artillery and all of the other military equipment that would be required to break through. And for another reason, this offensive is sort of one of the most widely advertised offensives in the history of warfare. They've been talking about it for a number of weeks, up and down the chain of command. People are talking about it. And typically that's not a recipe for success, because when you want to launch an offensive operation against a long front line, you want to keep it a secret in terms of where it's going to be anyway. These sort of analogous operations that were carried out in World War I, they learned after a while that secrecy was actually more important than artillery preparation. They used to, when they started out, they would bombard the enemy where they were hoping to break through for hours, sometimes even days, to try to soften up the adversary. But all that did really is tell the adversary where the offensive was happening and gave them an opportunity to rush reinforcements to that sector. And so that when they finally did attack, they met a reinforced opposition that was able to just stop the offensive in its tracks. So typically, if you lose the advantage of surprise, that's not good. So we'll see what happens in this case. They have made some territory. This purple region that you can see in the map is territory that's been regained, and so it's possible that they'll be able to continue that. But they're coming up against the suburbs of Kherson there, which is going to be more densely held and lead to more urban fighting. So if we go to the next slide. So we have here a war of attrition. These initial ambitious blitzkrieg-style offensives were thwarted. The key Western aid at that point was the Javelin shoulder-mounted anti-tank weapon that you may remember from the early days of the war. That really enabled the Ukrainians to halt these Russian armored columns and prevent them from maneuvering freely and bringing their firepower to bear. So that was extremely important. But now we're in the second phase, where it's a war of attrition, which are often characterized by artillery duels. And we're talking about heavy artillery firing tens of thousands of shells per day. The Ukrainians are firing 6,000 to 8,000 shells per day. It's estimated that they have to do 3 or 4 times that amount in the Kherson region if they were to be successful. So artillery is really the big king of the battlefield, as they sometimes say in these sorts of wars. You may have heard about the another Western weapon that's been playing a role here, the HIMARS, which is a rocket launch system that we've been supplying to the Ukrainians. And it has been effective. The great thing about it is that it can strike behind enemy lines for many tens of kilometers, even low hundreds of kilometers in some versions. And so the Ukrainians have been using this to strike Russian ammunition depots and force them to not mass supplies close to the front lines. So that's been helpful. On the other hand, there's only 12 of them in Ukraine, and they've only been promised 16 of them. So it's not exactly going to turn the tide of battle in a major way yet, unless the numbers get somewhat larger than that. So that's kind of where we are now. Both sides firing a lot of artillery. The Ukrainians trying to cope with the fact that the Russians have an artillery advantage, and develop tactics to try to scoot out from under Russian artillery and then come back, etc. So we'll see what happens. Next slide, please. So looking forward, how do wars of attrition end? Well, for one thing, they often don't end. At least they last for quite a long time. So Vietnam and Afghanistan were counterinsurgency wars of attrition, essentially. World War I was a large-scale conventional war of attrition. Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s was a two-player war of attrition. So we have a number of examples to draw upon. Sometimes you have one side collapses. Sometimes you have one side simply gives up if there's a side that's sort of fighting voluntarily, not because it really has to. So the United States and Vietnam is the classic case of a counterinsurgent who decides to give up and go home. Russia and Afghanistan is another example of that back in the 80s as well. Germany in World War I is an example of a country that fought to the very end and then basically collapsed. They had a spring offensive that actually succeeded in the West in 1918, but it was eventually stopped, and that was basically all she wrote as far as Germany was concerned. It was gradually pushed back, and finally the whole army collapsed. There can be sort of dramatic end game sort of collapses in these conflicts, or there can be a negotiated settlement. So the Korean War, essentially, there's a lot of very dramatic back and forth, huge changes in territorial possession back in 1950 and 51, and then it completely stabilized around the front line from 51 to 53. And they finally were able to negotiate a settlement, which was based on the front lines at that point. The Iran-Iraq War was similar, but they basically fought their way back to the status quo ante and settled on that with some minor adjustments. So they can end through negotiated settlements, but often after a long time, and often reflecting the existing battlefield outcomes. Of course, the Ukrainians are extremely motivated to take all the territory back that they've lost since February. So it's unlikely that they're going to give in or give up, except in a possibly temporary way, to anything short of that. Russia, on the other hand, of course, would perceive that as a loss if they retreated to the status quo ante. So it would probably be the case that the Ukrainians would have to simply win that territory back in order to regain it, even in some sort of negotiated settlement. With one wildcard being if Putin was overthrown. Sometimes when you have a change in leadership in one of the countries, then the war can end much more quickly. And in fact, the Korean War ended in part because Stalin died, also in 1953, and that helped negotiations. I think there's one more slide. Another concern that a lot of people have, of course, is what about escalation? So is it possible that there could be a direct NATO-Russia war? And I'm still fairly optimistic, I guess, is one way to frame it, of thinking that that's unlikely. I think Russia is unlikely to attack NATO with conventional weapons because Russia would lose a NATO conventional war with NATO in a pretty dramatic fashion. So I think that would be extremely foolish of them to do that. That leaves the nuclear option, and I still think that Russia is unlikely to use nuclear weapons because that would run the risk of a U.S. retaliation. And U.S. nuclear weapons, I mean, Russia has nuclear weapons that are capable of hitting the United States, but the United States also has a very advanced nuclear arsenal, much more advanced than the Russians at this point, much more useful for counterforce strikes. And I just don't think the Russians want to push it to the point of a counterforce war with nuclear weapons against the United States, not even over this issue. The one scenario which I can envision in which this might really get close to happening would be, what if Russia starts some massive extermination campaign against civilians? It could be using nuclear weapons against Ukrainians, directly dropping a nuclear weapon on Kyiv, for instance, or just setting up Holocaust-style extermination camps and killing hundreds of thousands or millions of Ukrainians. I think at that point there would be enormous pressure on NATO to do something despite the nuclear risks. And so you might see an avenue towards escalation because of that. But in fact, because of that, I think Russia would be extremely cautious about going in that direction. They've done a lot of war crimes. They've killed a lot of people, but they haven't killed as many people as they could yet. So I think there's still some deterrent-based restraint keeping this war at a lower level than it might be in terms of civilian fatalities. All right, I will leave it there and pass the baton to our next speaker.
Andrew, thanks for that setup. Very useful. And we now turn to Professor Yoshiko Herrera, Professor of Comparative Politics and International Relations and former Director of the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia. Her research spans topics including Russian politics, nationalism, identity, and ethnic politics, political economy, and international norms. Her work's been published by numerous outlets, including Cambridge University Press, Cornell University Press, Perspectives on Politics, Comparative Politics, Social Science Quarterly, Post-Soviet Affairs, and other journals. At UW-Madison, she teaches courses on comparative politics, social identity, and post-communist politics. Before coming to Madison in 2007, she was the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard, the Madison of the East. Thank you for joining us this evening, Professor Herrera. Please tell us more, add on to what Professor Kydd laid out for us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And let me start by, I want to follow Professor Kydd's presentation of the current status of the war by revisiting a couple of the questions that we had when the war started. So next slide, please. Thanks. So when the war first started, it took many people by surprise. And there were questions about why the war, why Putin decided to invade, what were the motivations. And I think these are relevant for understanding the possibilities for ending the war. And so I want to revisit the question of why the war started as a kind of background to how we understand where we're going. I think that right now, there's really no question that Russia's goal is to destroy Ukraine as a country. There's no acceptance or appreciation in the Putin regime of Ukrainian sovereignty, that is the right to exist as an independent state. And there's clear evidence that Russia would like to eliminate Ukraine as a nation, separate from Russia. That's in rhetoric and also in actions. So I don't think any of the other stated pretexts for the war, namely the potential for a NATO invasion through Ukraine into Russia, genocide of Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk, independence for Donetsk and Luhansk, biological weapons, all the other things that the regime has stated, I think we can understand now from their actions that the main target has been Ukraine and to destroy Ukraine as a country. Second, I think that when we think about why this happened, the unrealistic imperial ambitions really comes to the fore. In the two pictures there, on the left is Alexander Nevsky, a 13th century prince who was actually the first Russian Orthodox saint. He's a he's a revered character in Russia. Putin just recently suggested to the Russian media that they should start making comparisons of him to Nevsky in their media pieces, and he clearly sees himself as somebody who is going to unite or create some sort of greater Russia. I think one of the ways that that manifests itself is a general disregard for sovereignty of the former Soviet space, but it's not an exact replica of either the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. But there's a general understanding that unless states go along with Russia, they are going to face consequences such as Ukraine. I think it's important, therefore, to understand that despite some people arguing that NATO or the West has a role in causing this war, or that somehow NATO provoked Russia into the war, that the actions of the last 5 months suggest that's not the case. And also the damage that's been done to Russia in the last 5 months also reveals that the Putin regime does not care about the Russian economy, about Russian citizens, about ethnic Russians. The regime is willing to essentially destroy Russia as a country in order to fulfill this kind of crazed vision of a larger Russia. Something else that I think is really important is to understand Putin as untrustworthy and malevolent. And those words I'm choosing carefully because untrustworthy means that the idea of compromising, making a deal, somehow negotiating for peace, this is not going to work with an actor that is not trustworthy. Because what it means to trust somebody is to let your guard down in the expectation that when you do so, they will not take advantage of you. But what we have with Putin is exactly the opposite, someone who will take advantage of you if you let your guard down. And that was actually a recent example of that was in the negotiated deal to get Ukrainian grain out of the Black Sea and through Turkey into North Africa and the Middle East. The very day after that deal was signed, with some fanfare, the Russians bombed the port of Odessa, where the grain is supposed to be shipped out of. So that's just kind of a signal that of their untrustworthiness, and I think we've seen that throughout the conflict, that they say one thing and do something else. And I think the malevolence in some ways speaks for itself. But I think we have to understand that's the kind of regime that we're dealing with, unfortunately. But back to the question of why did Russia invade? In addition to the imperial ambitions, I think that it's clear the decision to invade was a massive miscalculation that vastly underestimated Ukrainian resolve and capabilities. And I think Russia continues to do that. Also, massively wrong about the Western response. The Putin regime expected that Europe and the US would be divided, that we would respond in a very limited way, similar to what happened following Crimea in 2014. So they didn't expect the sanctions, they didn't expect the military support, and they continue to underestimate, I think, the Western response. And finally, I think the Russian military capabilities have been probably surprising to everyone, both to the Russian side and to Ukraine and to others that are watching. Just the incompetence, cruelty, and lack of capability of achieving even limited goals is kind of striking. One parallel, I think, however, is to look at the Russian behavior in the two Chechen wars. The first Chechen war from 94 to 96, which actually ended in a humiliating defeat for the Russian army. I think we saw some of that initially. But in the second Chechen war, prosecuted by Putin, which started in 2000 and went until 2009, that war was a war of massive bombardment of Chechen territory and massive use of violence against civilians and the population, and cut off of Chechnya for various reasons from the external world, from media, et cetera, that allowed the Russians to commit huge atrocities there with very little pushback from anyone. And I think that we're seeing some of that again, that this incompetence is coupled with kind of unlimited cruelty and willingness to target civilians in order to wear down the population. But let me shift a little bit to the domestic politics of each country, which I think is another way to think about how the war is going. Next slide, please. Okay, within Russia, some people, including myself, had hoped that given the massive scale of wrongdoing on Putin's part in terms of this invasion, that there might be some hope for people in Russia standing up to the regime and at least showing the lack of support. But unfortunately, 22 years of Putin's regime systematically sidelining, jailing, exiling, poisoning, murdering his opposition has led to a situation where there are very few safe avenues for protest at all. The lower slide picture is Alexei Navalny, who's one of the main opposition figures, who's been in jail now for over a year. He's the person that Putin jailed. He put his brother in jail 2 years ago. He tried to murder him with poison. And Navalny nevertheless went back to Russia and was immediately arrested, and he remains in jail. Other opposition leaders have also been arrested. And the general population faces a lot of fear and selective punishment. So you could be, not a famous person, just a private citizen expressing discontent or disagreement with the war. Even using the word war is punishable, actually. And maybe nothing will happen to you, but maybe you will be arrested. And if you're not a prominent person, maybe nobody will visit you. Nobody will care about you. And so it's very disheartening for people who are opposed to the war to understand what they can do, because they potentially face imprisonment, they face harassment in various ways, they can be fired from their jobs. And part of the Putin strategy is to make people think that that everybody is for the regime and no one agrees with any of the opposition. And so it's hard for people to organize collectively, given the 22 years of institutional manipulation and given the current context of fear and violence. A manifestation of this lack of opposition is the fact that virtually no government officials have resigned from the Putin regime, even people that some people might have thought had more liberal dispositions. The one government official who was sort of high-ranking who did leave, Anatoly Chubais, who had been somebody very much part of the rise of Putin and part of the Russian privatization, he actually fled the country, went to France, and just this week, he's in the hospital with a mysterious nerve ailment. And I think there's a decent chance that will turn out to be a poisoning, though it's unclear at this point. Okay, but what else is happening in Russia besides the crackdown on opposition? The economy is quickly moving towards autarky, that is, being cut off from the world. The picture above is the removal of a McDonald's sign and replacement with the Russian version. They basically nationalized all the McDonald's restaurants, and they've come up with the Russian version of McDonald's, which is called Tasty, and that's it. Вкусно и точно. So that's a sign of Russia's connection to the world. It's just a symbol, really. But instead of being part of the global web of McDonald's chains, they're now having to make their own Russian version. And that's just happening across the board. IKEA is out. There's many Western companies that are out. And Russia faces a lot of problems with high technology imports that have pretty much come to a halt. So, for example, their civilian aviation industry is pretty much destroyed. Their car industry, they're no longer putting airbags or anti-lock brakes in their cars because they can't get those parts from abroad. Putin remains very much in control of the media. The presentation of the war is that it's temporary, that it's going to end any day now. They're very close to victory. And I think that this is buying him some time in terms of domestic population and the lack of opposition, because people think, well, what if this is all going to end very soon? Maybe something's going to happen. So there's a sense that it's not clear what the next step is, and so people may be waiting. But this idea of temporary is actually part of the Putin strategy. And then finally, in terms of the war costs, even though there have been a lot of casualties, these are unevenly distributed We don't have like solid data on this, but there's a lot of anecdotal data and data based on names and what has been released, that the conscripts and contract soldiers are mainly coming from poor regions of Russia rather than from Moscow or St. Petersburg. And so in the main areas where Putin would face the most opposition, namely the two largest cities, those places have been to some extent shielded from at least the military side of the war costs. Next slide. Okay, I'll try to move quickly here. Within Ukraine, in some ways, there hasn't been a lot of change. From the start, there was united opposition against Russia. The support for Volodymyr Zelensky shot up right after the invasion, and it remains high. Zelensky, interestingly, has made some choices to remove and replace government ministers, a couple of them. And most of the reasons are for citing treason or corruption. And one of the things is that they're constantly on the lookout for Russian operatives within the Ukrainian government. And so that's kind of interesting, but it doesn't really change the overall dynamic of Ukrainian support for the government. One thing I want to note on the upper picture is a sad picture of the city of Vinnytsia, which was hit with artillery a couple weeks ago, and a 4-year-old girl died. There's on a lot of news coverage of it. And there have been Russian missile strikes across Ukraine, not just in the Donbass region or in the frontline areas, but in other cities. And I think that the Russians may be thinking that, like Chechnya, they will wear down the population, and that these atrocities will make Ukrainians think they should give up and surrender or compromise. But I think my opinion is that just the opposite is happening, that these atrocities are strengthening Ukrainian resolve because they're showing people what it will be like to live under Russian rule, which is more violence against civilians and curtailment of basic rights. I think the areas that Russia currently controls militarily in the Donbass are a bit more complicated because a lot of Ukrainians, since those wars have been going on in the far part of the Donbass since 2014, a lot of pro-Ukrainian Ukrainians have left the region. And a lot of people who are left in the areas that are currently under Russian control are people who could not leave, either older people or people who are sick, and some people who are pro-Russian. And so understanding the possibility for insurgency in those regions has to take into account the demographic changes in terms of who's left in those regions. But for the unoccupied parts of Ukraine, I think it's fair to say that the resolve of Ukrainians to continue this fight and to push back Russia, at least to the February 23rd lines, is strong. Next slide. Okay, and I'll just conclude by saying, I think that Ukraine is going to remain committed to fighting Russia, regaining the territory that's been lost in this war. And I think for reasons I could go into in Q&A, Ukraine is going to prevail in this war. There's just no way Russia is going to take over a territory of that size and remove Ukraine as a country. I think that's impossible. But the costs for Ukraine in terms of its economy, in terms of the human toll, are going to be very high. So while I think Ukraine is going to win eventually, I think the cost is going to be great. In terms of Russia, Putin is not going to stop until he's militarily defeated. As I said earlier, he's totally untrustworthy, and that's why I think, as much as I'm for diplomacy in this case, that is not going to work with a character like Vladimir Putin. The sanctions, which I think Professor Copelovitch is going to talk more about, have to some extent degraded Russia's state capacity and ability to wage this war, but I think more could be done there, although I think they're going to definitely have a long-term effect on Russia. And the Russian economy is damaged, and the polity is damaged for decades to come. There's not a linear comparison where you can say we're back to 1990 or back to 1985. We're in a different version of an extremely high level of distrust of Russia and the regime, and unwillingness to work or cooperate with Russia for years to come. And unfortunately, I think that the domestic opposition to Putin remains very limited. So without something dramatic happening, unfortunately, I think he's there for a while. Thank you.
Thank you for those thoughts. We have a lively chat stream, and we'll have some great questions coming up. We'll bring you back in a few minutes after we hear from Mark Copelovitch. He's a professor of political science and public affairs in the Robert La Follette School at UW-Madison. He's also the director of the UW's Center for European Studies and an affiliate of the Center for German and European Studies and the Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence. He specializes in international political economy and international organizations with a focus on the politics of international trade, international finance, the IMF, and European integration. He's the author of the International Monetary Fund and the Global Economy, Banks, Bonds, and Bailouts, Cambridge University Press, as well as articles in Comparative Political Studies, the Journal of Politics, International Organization, and the Review of International Organizations. Mark, thanks for joining us and giving us a bit of a broader perspective on what you think this war is doing to the future evolution of the global economy.
Great. Thanks for having me back. Good to be here. So as Yoey mentioned, I'm going to talk about the economic impact of the war, mostly in Russia. I'll start talking about Ukraine, the global economic impact, and then the global political impact as well. So the main point that I want to get across actually builds directly off what Yoey was talking about with the sanctions. The sanctions are working exactly as expected, right? Right after the invasion in February, the U.S. and eventually the U.S., the European Union, the entire G7, so Canada, Japan, et cetera, Switzerland joining in, kind of the world's major Western, powers in global trade and finance, put in a set of trade and financial barriers, more or less to cut Russia off from the global economy. And as I'm going to show you with a bunch of pictures and charts, that has happened, right? And as Yoey alluded to, the Russian economy really is in a comprehensive, multi-dimensional way collapsing and decoupling from the global economy. The question is, well, to what extent do sanctions undercut Russia's ability to fight the war and domestic political stability? And that's where they're not a panacea, right? So I'll come back and talk about that. I'll talk about the Russia-Ukraine war really has come after the global pandemic economic crisis. And the short version is everything that was going on that was bad in terms of an economic slowdown and rising inflation is now going to last longer because of that. And there's some very specific impacts on things like oil, gas, and food because of Russia's position in the global economy as a major exporter of those commodities. In terms of the global political impact, 2 points that I want to get across. The first is nothing facilitates international cooperation like a large-scale common external threat. And one thing that I think is very striking has been the resurgence of transatlantic ties between the U.S. and the Europeans and Western cooperation more broadly. And to some extent, what we are seeing is the very fear of Vladimir Putin and also to a great extent Xi Jinping in China of, a self-fulfilling prophecy of a united West, right, against Russia or against an axis of Russia and China. Something that we really have started to see when you think about the NATO military response, the economic sanctions response, et cetera. Next slide. So again, before I talk about the Russian economy, though, I do really want to emphasize that the devastation in Ukraine is enormous and incredibly sad. Right, this is an unprovoked invasion that has caused tens of billions of dollars of economic damage. Right, at some point there is going to be a Marshall Plan style global rescue that will be needed for Ukraine. Debt relief, money poured in for reconstruction of infrastructure, humanitarian aid, et cetera. But in addition to the massive civilian casualties and the war crimes that we've now seen, what we saw in March and April, particularly into Poland, was a refugee crisis, right, which now is starting to rival the Syrian refugee crisis from a few years ago in terms of scope and scale, right? So millions of people displaced internally within Ukraine, moving west from the areas that Russia now controls, as well as people moving into, west into countries in the EU and neighboring areas. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show you a set of charts here to try and really give you a sense of the comprehensive nature of the collapse of the Russian economy. So this is the first one, which is inflation. Right? Everybody's talking about inflation here in Russia, in Europe, everywhere else. Inflation in Russia is now about 16 or 20%. But because of the sanctions, which have basically severed the global supply chains for Russian industry, the numbers are more on the order of 40 to 60% when we're talking about technology, right? So we're starting to get into hyperinflationary type of scenarios where you really have an economy in free fall with prices increasing that fast. Next slide. And one of the things that has happened as there are massive shortages and an inability of Russia to import what it needs is a huge collapse in industrial production, right? So this is a study from the Yale Business School with some great data on the state of the Russian economy. And when you think about industrial manufacturing, you're talking about collapses of 10 to 50%, depending on what goods we're talking about. So an economy where you have 20 to 60% inflation and 10 to 50% collapse of domestic manufacturing is not an economy that is going to be able to sustain a war indefinitely. Right now, how long it can survive, right, and continue to fight the war is an open question. But there has been massive damage inflicted. Next slide. Similarly, on the monetary side, right, so you've probably seen this chart or seen in the news that the Russian governments and the global media to some extent saying, well, Russia managed to actually stabilize and save the ruble. If you remember the top left chart here, after the Russian invasion in March, the Russian ruble went into free fall. And then the exchange rate went from about 75 to about 140. And it's now back to 60 to the dollar, right? And so you look at that number and you start to say, well, it looks like actually Russia circumvented the sanctions, or they're not working, and they've kind of stabilized the ruble. But effectively, the way that they stabilized the ruble was to make it a currency which is no longer useful in the global economy, right? So the text on the top right is from a Financial Times article from last week about the capital controls that Russia put into place. Right? Basically, the way Russia has stabilized the exchange rate is to prevent everybody in Russia from taking their money out of the country and engaging in any transactions where you buy or sell dollars or euros. And so you've seen two things. One is the chart on the bottom left. You see the collapse where it says low liquidity. Nobody is buying and selling the ruble in global markets anymore, right? So you have a currency which effectively the central bank of Russia has propped up, but is not being bought and sold and traded in global markets. And Russia has used about half of its available foreign exchange reserves. The chart on the bottom right, one of the sanctions, about half of Russia's foreign exchange reserves, about 300 billion, was frozen by the Western powers in March and April because it is overseas in Western banks and central banks. And so Russia doesn't have access to half of its war chest of foreign exchange reserves. And the chart on the bottom right, it's spent the other half now artificially propping up the ruble. Right. So you have borderline hyperinflation, you have massively collapsing industrial production, and you have a currency which is worthless, which is a sign of Russia basically being cut off from international trade and finance. Next slide, please. And this chart and the next one is really the consequence of that. So what you're looking at here is exports of manufactured goods into Russia, right? From both neutrals and pro-Russian countries, as well as what we might call the allies, the EU, kind of the Western democratic powers. And you've had about a 60% collapse in manufactured exports, right? So that is what is leading to that collapse in production that I showed you earlier. Russia can't get the things it needs to keep the economy and the military running. Next slide. Now, one of the things that Putin claimed was going to happen, right, and that a lot of observers thought was, well, China is going to come to the rescue, right? Basically, over a 3-4 month period, that Russia is going to be able to reorient its economy to China and import the things it needs for manufactured production and to fight the war by getting it from China. That hasn't happened, right? You've seen the same level of collapse in exports from China to Russia, right? So you hear a lot in the news that Russia is still selling oil and gas, and that is true. But what Russia is not able to get in exchange for its oil and gas is the manufactured goods it needs for industrial production and to fight the war. Next slide. And the other thing that you heard in March and April was that there was going to be a pivot to the east, right? That if Germany and the rest of the EU and the Western countries were going to stop importing oil and gas over the next 6 months to a year or 2 years from Russia, while Russia, again, would offset that with a shift east, primarily to China, but also to other countries in East Asia. That's happened a little bit, but as you see from the map, the pipelines to make that happen don't really exist yet and aren't going to for years. And you see from the charts on the right here that China has started to buy more oil from Russia in the last several months, but it's doing so now at about a 35% discount from the global oil price. Right, so Russia's selling more oil, but it's getting less revenue because China is basically the only buyer, right, and it's negotiating cheaper prices. So as that continues, the amount of revenue Russia is bringing in from its oil and gas exports is much smaller than it would be if Russia were still plugged into the global economy. Next slide. So that's the Russian economy imploding. The next thing I want to talk about is how the conflict will affect the global economy. And I'll be very brief here. The IMF had a report that just came out a couple of weeks ago, which reinforces what I said at the start, which is all of the trends of declining growth that we are talking about now and the debates about whether we're in a recession in Europe, in the US, et cetera. The International Monetary Fund is now reducing its estimates of global growth, and we're much more likely to see an economic downturn, or at least a slowdown of global economic activity. Next slide. And because of rising oil prices, rising grain prices, rising gas prices, et cetera, that's really what's driving the inflation right now. And so all of the projections of the decline of inflation back to pre-COVID levels have now gotten extended out well into 2023 and into 2024. I think we're coming to the point where we really are at peak inflation and it's going to start coming down. But now the projections, we're talking about a year and a half or 2 years before that happens, rather than maybe a quarter or 2 or 3 quarters. Next slide. The other global impact, though, which has been pretty striking, is, right after the invasion, there was a massive spike in every commodity price. Russia is one of the world's leading oil exporters, one of the world's leading rare earth metal exporters, nickel, aluminum, wheat, etc. And these are just 2 charts. The line is wheat prices and the shaded area is oil prices. There was a big spike, right, in commodities. But what we've seen in the last couple of weeks now is commodity prices have actually fallen back to or below where they were before the war, right? So that's a modicum of good news, actually, in the sense that the impact of Russia on global commodity prices was very large, but it seems to have been temporary. Right? And some of that is increased production and refining capacity from countries like Canada, the US, and Norway. Shifting of liquefied natural gas exports from the US towards Europe and enabling Germany and others to wean themselves off of Russian gas. Some of it's going to be like the 1970s, and we're going to see a tripling of food prices and things like that. We're sort of less likely, I think, to see that now in the months ahead. Next slide. The one exception to that is natural gas, right? And you've probably heard about this in the news. And these are just some charts of the codependency of Russia and the EU, and Germany in particular, on each other for gas. And natural gas prices remain very, very high. This is a huge domestic political issue in Germany right now because they get, I think, about 70% of their gas from Russia. There is a big movement to move away from that. The graph on the right shows that Russian piped gas to Europe is falling and US liquefied natural gas shipments are rising. So what you're going to see over the next year or so is, I think, a wholesale shift in the sourcing of energy for EU countries away from Russia to other Western allies. but that's something that can't happen very quickly. That takes several quarters or a couple of years. It's not something that's going to happen in weeks, right? So this is a really big issue, and it's the big reason why inflation right now is actually now higher in Europe than it is in the United States, which was not the case during the peak COVID inflation last summer. Next slide. The last big global economic risk that I just want to flag, and again, you've probably seen this in the news, is a spike in global food prices. All right, so the first ship carrying grain from Odessa actually left a couple days ago, and that would be good in the sense that the major effects, the countries that are going to be hit hardest in many ways from this war are actually not the rich countries and the Western democracies. It's poorer countries and developing countries in the Middle East, in South America, in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia. Rising food prices, right? Worries about famine, right, in places like the Horn of Africa. As well, the chart on the right, one of the things we're seeing now as every rich country's central bank is raising interest rates to fight inflation, that leads global interest rates to rise, right? And so you're looking at emerging market bond spreads, right, where the price of paying your debt back over and above the price of U.S. Treasury bills. And what you're seeing is something very similar to what we saw in the 90s in the Asian financial crisis or the 80s in the Latin American debt crisis. Many poor countries borrow in foreign currency. They borrow in dollars or euros. And so when the interest rate rises because the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, the interest rate on your debt goes up, right? So one of the things we're really worried about in the global economy now is a wave of sovereign debt and financial crises in the developing world over the next couple of years that really starts to look like Asia in the 90s or Latin America in the 80s. That's a sort of, let's come back in 5 more months and see where that is. But it's a big concern right now. Next slide. The last thing I want to talk about is the global political impact. Right, and happy to talk about this more in Q&A. There's a bunch of stuff here, all of which is just to the point that I made at the start of, in some ways, what we have seen is the reaction of Putin and Russia, right? And the modest level of support of the Chinese government for Russia as well is making the thing that I think Putin fears the most becoming something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right. So what's happened in the last 5 months now? Well, the long-standing EU countries that were neutral for decades are now joining NATO, Sweden and Finland. Right. The fear of being ring-fenced by larger numbers of forward troops in an expanded NATO is becoming a reality. This chart in the middle is showing you the bolstering of NATO troops now in the Baltics and Poland and Hungary and Romania. Right. And even more broadly, what's happening now is a global league of democracies starting to really emerge. Right. So for the first time, the major Asia-Pacific democracies that are our close allies, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, were invited to the NATO summit last month and showed up. They're not NATO members, right? But suddenly you have the US, the Canadians, all of the European NATO members, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, all meeting together to talk about international security issues. And of course, as everybody knows from today's news, you have the Speaker of the House in Taiwan, right? And so globally, what I think has really happened over the last 5 months is you've started to see, again, with a common external threat of Russia and to some extent Russia and China, that the Western democracies not only economically have banded together with the sanctions response, but they're starting to politically band together with security cooperation as well. Right. Next slide. That said, right, and I will end here, which is the Western response or the NATO response, there still are important divisions, right? So this is just some data on the military aid that has been provided by NATO to Ukraine. On the left, it's absolute dollar amount, and on the right, it's percent of GDP. And it's pretty striking. It's really been an Anglo-Eastern European response, right? The countries that have stepped up have been the US, UK, and Canada, as well as the former East Bloc countries that are now members of NATO and the EU, right? The Baltics, Poland, Czech Republic in particular. The conspicuous absences are France and to some extent Germany. right? France has provided almost no military aid. And, that's sort of continuing a longstanding trend of France's ambivalence about NATO and very much wanting to be something of a third-party counterweight to the US and Russia in European relations. But it's very striking how little France has been a key player in this. And Germany, because of the gas dependence, right, and the Social Democrats who are, Olaf Scholz is now the chancellor, there's been lots of talk about the Zeitenwende, or the turn towards a new security policy that is going to be more contentious against Russia. But Germany has been less aggressive in responding in military aid and in terms of money than the US and the UK and some of the other major allied countries. So as much as on the one hand, I have said really the global political impact is the unity of the West, there are still important domestic divisions within some of the key countries. And as Andy and Yoey talked about, with the war dragging on over time, I think that's certainly going to be the case. It will be interesting to see whether fissures or cracks in the unity of the West really start to emerge as the economic pain lasts for a longer period of time. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions and Q&A. We can skip this one. I was going to basically benchmark my conclusions to Mark and say that most of the things that I thought were going to happen actually did happen, which is good, but not all of them did. So.
That's also true of Yoey and Andrew's comments that they made in our show in early March. So, we're getting up close to 8 o'clock. And one of the things I like about our show is you all get to talk most of the time. And that's how it should be. We've had a very lively chat. I'd say people got to their target heart rates tonight in the chat. It was pretty exciting. And, not everyone agrees. I'm just going to fire out some questions with attributions to people in the chat. Steve Cohen, Jeff Stewart, Bob Graham, James Rottenberg. There are a lot of our regulars had some great questions tonight. Pedro Pieri. So, Mark, I'm going to ask you. Steve Cohen wonders, and others wonder too. Is India kind of a surprise abettor of Putin for its own advantage and maybe buying natural resources? And isn't it true that it's really just the old Western alliance, European countries, the US, some of the G7, but a lot of the emerging market countries are on the sidelines. And so, this isn't quite the landslide against Putin that maybe we've made it sound like. So can you comment on that?
Yeah. I think Modi is very opportunistic, and I think it's an opportunity for him to get oil at a cut rate price. And play India's traditional role of being unaligned, in the Cold War is the kind of continuation of some of those policies. Yes, it is the old West, right? But the old Western countries are still the countries that dominate the financial side of the economy, right? Not as much on trade, but on finance. And so a lot of the sanctions, right? If you get, the G7, right, and a couple other countries, you've got most of global finance. I think the difference is what I said of the links between the Pacific traditional Western powers and the European transatlantic traditional Western powers is something that has not always existed, and I think has been new. The other one is Brazil, right? So Brazil has been economically taking advantage of this, pitching itself as, well, we are the outside democratic supplier of agricultural commodities. And I think actually they're going to be a big trade beneficiary the longer this goes on.
Yeah.
And that realign.
Well, Yoey, I wanted to ask you a question anyway.
To kind of move.
Oh, sorry. Yoey, I'm just going to ask you, Jeff Stoyer wondered, what do typical Russians understand as the reason for this operation? And how do you explain the high levels of support internally for Putin that we see in the media?
Okay, I think on the second part of that, the key issue is we don't know the non-response rate. So there's tremendous pressure to support the regime, and people who don't support the regime are unlikely to say that to a pollster. So I think the straightforward answer for why the polls suggest 80+% support for Putin is that only people who support the regime are willing to answer the polls. That's the first thing. Having said that, I think there's still nevertheless a high level of support for Putin. Not that high, but there's a lot of people that supported the regime. I don't think people in Russia understand what's going on there because it's supposedly not a war. It's just a special military operation. It was supposed to be about liberating Donetsk and Luhansk. That was the stated goal. But then they went to Kiev. And why are they invading Kiev if they're supposed to be supporting Russians in the Donbass? So I think a lot of people, there's a general anti-Americanism, a general, NATO is kind of annoying and out to get us. But why are we fighting a war in Ukraine is not obvious, I think, to many people there. And I think people are willing to even Putin supporters are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt as long as he doesn't destroy their lives. So I think that's where there's the sense of temporariness of, if this is like a short thing and then things will get back to normal, like, okay, but where are we going? Why are we doing this? I think that there's a lot of uncertainty within the country for a lot of people of why, even regime supporters, of why they're there. And you can see that in the shifting narratives that the regime supporters give, even on TV, even on state-controlled TV.
Okay. I'm going to go back to Mark with a question, then I'll go to Andrew. Mark, you showed a lot of data on China-Russian trade and that China's not coming to the rescue. Are we completely confident in the data that we get about China-Russia economic interactions? How would we know for sure that there isn't more movement of goods between China and Russia?
Yeah. I think we're fairly confident. I think what we know is that the Western data is quite good, right? And we know there is evidence that factories are shutting down and equipment is being stripped for parts and semiconductors, right, to kind of do military repairs and things like that. So even if you believe the data is not good, indirectly that stuff wouldn't be happening if there was an influx of manufactured exports from China to Russia. I think we also know that as much as the Belt and Road Initiative and kind of China's infrastructure investments have been touted as shifting its exports away from the kind of U.S. codependency, that hasn't happened yet, right? The infrastructure for large scale exports from China to Russia simply doesn't exist, just like the pipelines don't exist. It could in the next 3, 4, 5 years, but it's not something in the last 5 months that you can really just flip a switch and suddenly move everything that you used to be sending to Germany or used to be sending to the United States and send it over to Russia.
Andrew, how committed do you think the Russian military is to the special military operation, as Putin calls it?
Well, I think they're committed to do it so long as the organization is holding together. I don't think they're enthusiastic about it from the top to the bottom. I think there are some people, I'm sure, who are ideologues who support the idea of reconstituting the Russian Empire, and so might view it enthusiastically. But I would, my sense is that the majority are doing it because that's who they are. That's their job. They're in the military. They're military officers, and they're fighting the war. And I think you see a lot of the disaffection, a lot of the poor performance, poor maintenance. Frankly, a lot of the war crimes suggest indifference, ill-disciplined troops who are not happy about what they're doing, not responsive to discipline, and are kind of like taking it out basically on the vulnerable people around them. I think all that suggests, a fighting force that does not really have its heart in it in any way, like nowhere close to what you see on the Ukrainian side. That said, like if your main job is to be behind the front lines and fire your artillery at the enemy, you don't need necessarily that much dedication to be willing to do that. And the people at the front lines, are facing pretty stark choices. Like if you desert, that's very risky. If you refuse to fight, that's also extremely risky. So they're caught in a dilemma. So yeah, I think they're not nearly as motivated as the Ukrainian side, but there are a lot of substitutes for motivation in a coercive environment like that, which will work up to a certain point, right? If things really start to fall apart, then you could see some widespread collapse. I mean, if you're looking for historical examples, you can go back to World War I, and the Russian army basically falls apart in 1917. Fairly suddenly and fairly completely, and people are just like streaming back towards their home, villages and whatnot, because the coercive apparatus is gone. Right, we're not nearly at that point yet, but that's sort of like the end of the road, which certainly has to be uppermost in people's minds when they're trying to keep this thing going.
Well, thank you all. We are over time, but this was a great segment. We had great audience feedback. As I said, a lot of passion and excitement out there. Even some dimensions of passion that we don't typically want in the chat. But be that as it may, thank you all for taking time out of your schedules. This was really informative, and we got a lot of great feedback. So thanks again. We'll have you back. Hopefully, we'll have you back in 2 months when this is all over. Wouldn't that be great?
That would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Well, let's hope for that. Thank you all to our viewers, our speakers. Great segment tonight. We will be back for sure by early September, if not before. Great segment tonight. Thanks for being here on Wisconsin.
You can try, but you'll never stop a badger. Because we badgers are born with curious minds and endless heart. When we see a curve in the road, we speed up. When there are mask shortages for first responders, we make our own supply chain. When there's a world on pause, we sharpen our claws. Through thunder, fire, and pandemics, we'll keep going. Because after all, you can't stop a badger.